Hello and welcome to the Starting a Podcast for Beginners 5-part series. This is the series where I take your podcast from idea stage to published across all major platforms. If you haven't seen part 1, you'll find it in the description below. Stage 2 of the process is where you'll be putting together the details of your podcast and it will start to take shape. So these are things like when you'll be releasing the podcast, what it's going to be called, the tagline, the description, the format of the podcast, whether it's an interview podcast or a solo podcast, just things like that will give you a good idea of what the podcast is going to look and feel like. So open up your plans again that you started in the first video and let's nail down those podcast details. So to get started, let's pick a date when you're going to launch your podcast and stick to it. You need plenty of time to prepare, record your trailer and first episodes. I recommend leaving a 10-week gap between when you first start planning and when your first episode will come out, because you need a couple of weeks for the podcast platforms to pick up your content once you've uploaded it to your host. You're going to be recording a few episodes, you're going to be putting your cover art together and things like that. So if you need to time it for any kind of particular reason, then obviously that's down to you. But I do recommend giving it at least a couple of months. So for my podcast, you can see there that I've just put in the date that I felt was good for the launch. And I launched it on a Tuesday. And Tuesday is when my episodes come out. I think Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday are good days to launch your episodes, but you know your target audience, so whatever you think will work best for them. And now we're going to come up with a name for your podcast. Now, coming up with a unique name can be tricky, and it's important that it is unique. There are so many podcasts. When you search on Spotify or iTunes or something, you search for a podcast name and you'll often see another podcast with exactly the same name. And this is something you really need to avoid, because even though that original podcast might not have a trademark for the name, and I can't offer any kind of legal information or advice on this, but I just feel like it's a bit of a risk having the same name as another podcast, especially if it's quite a big one. You don't want them to be sending you letters or emails saying you need to take your podcast down. We've just noticed that you've got exactly the same name as us and you're already 100 episodes in, or even you could end up getting flagged by the podcast platform itself, like iTunes or something, and it could take your podcast down. So I'd be sure to search the internet, Google and all the podcast platforms, and on Podchaser as well, which is a directory for podcasts. Make sure that the name you pick isn't already in use. Now, if you're struggling to think of a name, one that really capture the essence of your podcast in just a couple of words, I'm going to help you. I'm going to show you how I came up with the name for mine. So I've moved over to Canva now. This is a kind of basic design program. You may have seen it before. You can use paper or you can use another mind mapping tool like Miro or something. Basically, what we're going to do, we're going to fill out these boxes. So think about the main aspects of your podcast. So for example, if you're putting together a podcast that teaches students how to cook, one of the main elements of the podcast would be cooking, obviously. And then branching off of that, you'd be thinking of different synonyms for cooking, different elements of cooking that encompasses the overall theme of the podcast. So, we're doing word association here. So food, for example, just putting some words together that you could use in your podcast name. And then what other element is there of your podcast? There's the topic itself, and there's also who's listening to it, which is students. So that's a word in itself, student. So the student cooking podcast is obviously a name that you could give it. But this is really basic. We're going to try and think of something a bit more interesting, and then think about words that you'd associate with students that would work for your podcast. And I guess the third aspect of it is the fact that it's a podcast. So thinking of words that are associated with podcasts. You don't necessarily have to put the word podcast or the something podcast in your name. It's very common to do that. I don't think it's really necessary. But, words that are maybe associated with podcasts that could also fit in with the other words. So, for example, I'm thinking digest, like digesting food, and also the use of the word in digesting information. And then, you might have more aspects to your podcast and you'll have to expand this a little bit more. But just giving you a general idea. And then once you've filled this out with, a few dozen words in each category, you might start thinking of of some ways of combining these words. So if we just get some text out, we can start formulating some names. So for example, Campus Kitchen. I'm not saying any of these are fantastic names or anything, or that any of them aren't taken. It's just an example to show you what you can do. Student Digest, whatever. So just put together some names. I recommend coming up with a few names, because if you just think of one name and then you're sort of married to it and you love it and you don't want to part with it, and then you go searching and then you find that it's already in use, or it's the name of a company or something, you do want it to be something quite unique, but also searchable and obvious what it's actually offering the listener. I'm just going to move over to my mind map for my podcast name, just so you can see a more in-depth one. So mine is about success and growth in your business, achieving success through podcasting. It's about podcasting, so I've obviously got a lot of words that are associated with podcasting, and it's about community, like connecting with other podcasters. So I've put a few names together here. A lot of them were already taken or just were a bit boring, I found. And then I settled on Podcasting Amplified, because it's about amplifying the message at the end of the day. That's kind of the bottom line of why a lot of people want to put their podcast together. And it is about podcasting, so it's relevant to have the word podcasting in the title. And also, it's actually similar to one of the slogans that I use for the business, so it works perfectly. And it wasn't taken, so I got pretty lucky with that one, and I'm happy with the name. But it might take you a little time. Just try not to dwell on it for months and months, and it stops you from actually taking action. Like, the name isn't going to make or break your podcast. It's more about the content. Some other things to think about with the name are that you don't want to have like special characters in there, like brackets and things, ideally, because it makes it more difficult to search, and some platforms just won't even display it correctly. You also don't want to include profanity, because again, that can get you kicked off the platforms, and you don't want it too long. Like, I think this one here is getting to be a little bit long. You want it to be able to show up on the podcast platform, on Spotify or whatever. You don't want it cut off. And you also want people to be able to remember it. So just a few more things to think about when you're deciding on a name. And if you're really struggling, you can always use AI like ChatGPT to help you come up with a name. So if you put all these words together, if you put in this work, then you could copy and paste a list of all those words into ChatGPT and ask it to come up with some podcast names for you based on your ideal listener and what the podcast is about and your list of words, and see if it comes up with anything. Obviously, a lot of the time it's going to come up with rubbish or stuff that's already taken. But if you're really struggling, it might be a way of prompting you. So I put the podcast name in there, and then I put together a one-sentence tagline, which for my podcast is to discover the secrets of podcasting success through shared experiences and expert insights. So this defines your unique offering to your ideal listener. So it wants to have those things in there. It's nice to have this one-sentence tagline so that if someone asks you what your podcast is about, you can just tell them. It gives you, it reinforces your own vision, and also you can use it on your website. So you want it to include what your podcast offers and sort of how it offers it. So what my podcast offers is that the listeners can discover the secrets of podcasting success, which in turn can help them bring their own success. And then it says how it does that through shared experiences and expert insights. It's going to be a host and guest interview. If you're hosting on your own, then it's going to be solo hosted, or if you're hosting with a friend, or maybe you have a mix of episodes and you can go for hybrid, whichever works best for you. And will you be publishing video episodes as well? Now, video is really popular in podcasting at the moment. It's a growing side of podcasting. More platforms are integrating video into them, but it does take more time. It means you've got to film them. It means you've got to edit the video as well. So it's something you could add later if you're not sure about adding it now. But just decide whether you will be uploading video versions of your podcast to YouTube and things, or if you're just going audio only. Now have a think about how your episodes are going to be laid out in terms of the running order of each episode. If you're going to have segments or particular sections of your podcast dedicated to certain things. So the layout of your episodes could be simple or complex depending on your show. At the very least, you'll have 3 segments. So starting off with your intro, then your main content, whether that's an interview or you going over a certain topic, and then your outro. And then you can plan that. It doesn't mean you can't change between different episodes, but just giving yourself a general idea. So for me, I've got a cold episode intro highlighting the key messages. That's host read. So in my podcast, I read out a description of the episode, which coming straight into that, I think can help grab people. Then it's going to have a short general intro, just with the musical theme, just to sort of bookend the show and for sonic branding. Then there's the interview. Then I want to get a call to action in the middle to divert listeners to downloading a piece of content that will be helpful to them, finishing off the interview and the general outro as well. So if you're not exactly sure how it's going to be run, don't worry too much yet. Just make sure that you've got a general idea, which is probably, again, going to be your intro, then your main content, and then an outro. Now, do you have some first episode or guest ideas planned out? If you don't, now is a good time to do it. You don't have to plan them out too heavily at this stage, but just having a general idea. If it's an interview show, maybe get a list together of 10 guests that you'd like to approach to be on your show. Or if you're teaching something, I'm sure you'll have some ideas of content based on maybe other content that you've put out or questions that you know your ideal listener are asking. At the end of this booklet, there is actually a section, an episode ideas section with 13 idea slots in each of these buckets, which are sort of like topics. So if you think of 4 or 5 buckets of content, so for example, if your niche is personal finance, your buckets might be budgeting, investing, financial literacy and income, then you can just think of some specific questions within those buckets to fill out these ideas. And that's only 13 ideas in each bucket, and that gives you a whole year of content ideas. Or you can use this for different guest ideas in your network. What is the release schedule of your podcast going to be? So is it going to be a weekly podcast? Is it going to be a daily, like a short daily news podcast? Is it going to be fortnightly or monthly? Whatever you pick, it's important to be consistent. Consistency is more important than just churning out as much content as you can within any given month. So think of a release schedule that you can stick to. If you can stick to once a week, that'd be great. If you don't think you'll manage that, you can always start with a fortnightly podcast and go up to a week and choose a day that you want to release it on. Like I said before, I like Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, so in the middle of the week, not the super busy Mondays or, Saturday and Sunday where people will be busy with family things. I think Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday is a good option. And the data suggests that these are popular listening times as well, but it's up to you. If you think another day will suit you and your audience better, then go for that. Now we're talking about marketing. We're not going to put a massive marketing plan together here or anything. We just want the general idea of how you're going to be getting your podcast out there to your ideal listener. Because if you build it, they won't necessarily come. It's not just a case of sticking it on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and hoping people will search for it and they'll turn up. You do need to actively share your podcast if you want people to listen to it, if you want it to grow. And you want them to take action as well. And this is what our call to action is all about. So I recommend sticking with one call to action at a time. So this is something you're going to be asking either in the beginning or the end, or maybe somewhere in the middle of your podcast, or maybe a combination of all those three, but it's going to be the same thing. People listen to their podcasts when they're driving, when they're exercising, when they're doing other things. You don't want to be bombarding them with saying, oh, go to my website and check out this, and go to our guest website and check out that, download and review and subscribe and everything. Think about the one thing that you want your listeners to do that will help you to grow your show and will help them as well. So early on in the process, when you're just starting, it's important that people are subscribing. They might just listen to your first episode, they might enjoy it, but they might actually forget to subscribe, and then they've only listened to one episode, they've forgotten all about it by next week. So a great call to action to start off with is just to ask them to subscribe. And then later on, you might want to ask people for reviews, or you might want to ask them to visit a certain place on a certain page on your website where they can download something useful that will help them with whatever their goals are. And then we've got a list here of the most popular kind of platforms that you can market your podcast on. So tick all that apply that you might think you'll use to share your podcast, but don't spread yourself too thin. There's no point in joining every single social media network and you don't really have fantastic content for any of them. You're better off sticking to one or two places that you know your ideal listeners hang out and posting content there, really trying to build it up. So an email list is great for keeping people updated, but that's something that requires a fair amount of setup, so you might not want to start off with that. You might have your own social media pages and you can list the ones that you're going to use. So whether that's Instagram, LinkedIn, whatever. Or you might have company social media. If it's a podcast for your business, then you might also be sharing on your company's social media pages. And then other options, you've got paid advertising, or you might have a marketing agency. If you've got a big budget behind your podcast, then your marketing agency will be taking care of all this anyway. And then finally, having a think about where your episodes are actually going to show up. So I'm not talking about things like Spotify and iTunes and everything, because all podcasts should be on those platforms. But I'm talking about a kind of home base, a website that people can go and find more information. It might have a list of all your episodes. It might have blog posts. It might have your products and services if, again, you're doing this for a business. So if you have already an existing website, you can find a space for your podcast on there. When you sign up to a podcast host like Buzzsprout, Captivate, Libsyn, things like that, you'll automatically get a free host website with most of them. So it just gives you a link to a general kind of website where people can find your podcast episodes and links to various platforms. Or you might want to put together a brand new website, which means you're going to have to buy the URL for your podcast and either design a website yourself or get someone else to design it for you. So have a think about what you want to do. It is preferable to have a dedicated website for your podcast. But again, not to overwhelm you. If you just want to get started before all that, you can always just stick with your free host website at the beginning. And then when you've got more of a budget, you could outsource and get a website put together. Or you can use a simple service like Podpage, where they have simple tools to help design podcast websites. For my podcast, I'm going to be hosting them on my company website. I've also bought the domain name for the podcast, which just diverts back to the company website. And then also, obviously, I get the free host website with my host. So take some time to think through these details. Again, you can always update them later and then check these off as you go. So now your podcast is starting to take shape, or at least the plan is, and you now know who your podcast is for, why you're podcasting, and the general details of what the podcast will look and feel like. In stage 3, you'll be looking at the assets for your podcast, the common assets like the intro and outro and cover art that you'll need for every episode. I'm going to show you exactly how to put those together. If you've written a tagline for your podcast, I'd love to hear it in the comments. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any more valuable podcasting content. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.